The Geneva process is exposing something the West has tried to hide behind slogans for 3 years. This war is being negotiated not from a position of Ukrainian strength, but from the arithmetic of collapse. The very existence of a U.S. deadline, the frantic, updated, and refined framework, and the Europeans' rush to rewrite it all point to one simple reality. Washington now treats the conflict as a fire to contain, not a victory to win. Reuters reporting makes this plain. The U.S. draft requires Ukraine to accept territorial loss, renounce NATO ambitions, and cap military size, things that would have been politically unthinkable for the West to say out loud in 2022 or even 2024. Russia didn't force these words onto paper with rhetoric. It forced them with terrain. Diplomacy here is downstream from the front line. When Putin says the U.S. plan can be a basis for peace, but warns that rejection means Russia advances further, he is not bluffing to sound tough for domestic TV. He is stating the logic of momentum. If the side that is losing refuses a settlement, the side that is winning simply keeps taking what it wants until the loser's bargaining position evaporates. That is exactly what Moscow has signaled in the Security Council meeting, and Reuters confirms Putin's framing. Now look at the European counterproposal you summarized. It is not a peace plan. It is a narrative weapon built to fail in Moscow, so that Brussels can scream, Russia rejected peace while continuing a war it cannot sustain. The edits you highlighted are not minor technical tweaks. They are a systematic attempt to roll back every clause that recognizes Russia's core war aims. Take the NATO issue. The Europeans want to delete any meaningful constraint on NATO expansion, replacing it with vague language about consensus that doesn't exist. That is political theater. Everyone understands that consensus doesn't exist today is not a guarantee against consensus tomorrow. It is a trapdoor built into the text. Keep NATO membership alive on paper so a future U.S. administration can reopen the door after the ceasefire when Ukraine is rearmed and the West thinks Russia is distracted. From Moscow's point of view, that's not peace, it's Minsk 3.0. The same freeze and rearm game Russia believes it was subjected to before 2022. The don't repeat Minsk line floating around Geneva is almost comic in its hypocrisy. They're repeating Minsk in broad daylight, but trying to market it with new branding. Then the troop cap. The U.S. draft already strains Russia's stated demilitarization goal. The European move to hike peacetime numbers upward is basically a confession. Europe wants Ukraine to remain a massive forward army on Russia's border, funded by outsiders, and politically tethered to NATO regardless of formal membership. Saying 800,000 inches peacetime is not security policy, it's a permanent mobilization state. And who exactly is supposed to pay for that? The same Europe that is already scraping for frozen Russian assets because its own fiscal capacity is exhausted? The EU proposal assumes an infinite Western wallet in a world where Western voters are already tapping out. The frozen assets clause is the clearest tell. Europe isn't even pretending to negotiate anymore. It's writing a victor's restitution demand while behaving like a loser militarily. Keep Russian sovereign funds frozen until Russia pays damages to Ukraine? That is not a bargaining position you take when your side is retreating. It is a propaganda position you take when your real objective is to sabotage talks, then blame Russia for walking away. If you want to see the strategic divide in one sentence, Washington is trying to cap losses. Brussels is trying to deny losses exist. The U.S. may still posture, but its draft implicitly acknowledges the battlefield verdict. Europe's draft tries to reverse the verdict with wordsmithing. That's why the Europeans are so angry at being sidelined. They're angry not because they want peace, but because the U.S. is beginning to accept a reality Europe cannot accept without politically self-destructing. Europe's problem is not just ideological, it's institutional. The EU has spent years turning the Ukraine war into a federalizing engine, using the crisis to centralize budgets, harmonize defense procurement, expand surveillance and censorship authorities, and discipline member states under a wartime unity banner. Your source text says it bluntly. Ukraine has become the pretext for Brussels to accelerate a US-style federal model. That sounds conspiratorial to some ears, but in practice, it's not mysterious at all. Bureaucracies grow through emergencies. Brussels is no different. If the war ends on terms that look anything like Russian success, that federalizing momentum stalls and the entire ideological project loses oxygen. So the EU elite needs a war without end, or at least a war without defeat. But here's the part they cannot escape. Wars don't care about elite narratives. A collapsing front line is the ultimate veto power. Your excerpts mention Russian advances and the panic they cause in Kyiv. Whether every specific town claim is correct or not, the macro pattern is hard to fake. Russia has sustained a multi-year industrial war, expanded munitions output, stabilized its economy under sanctions, and kept mobilization politically survivable. Meanwhile, Ukraine is bleeding manpower, burning through Western stockpiles, and relying on future promises that keep shrinking. Even the pro-Ukraine press now quietly talks about stalemates and hard choices, because the old fantasy strategic defeat of Russia is dead outside of a few European capitals. That's also why Russia's diplomatic posture looks calm. Moscow doesn't need a spectacular show. It needs to look reasonable and patient while the battlefield keeps shifting in its favor. Your Spanish language source makes a key point in its own raw way. Ambiguity helps Russia because it corrodes Ukrainian morale. That isn't a moral judgment. It's a sociological fact about armies. Soldiers who believe their politicians may sell the fight out from under them stop risking their lives for positions that might be bargained away tomorrow. Geneva talk itself becomes a weapon against Kyiv, regardless of what Moscow says. Russia can keep fighting and still say, we are open to peace on realistic terms. That is a win-win posture. Putin signaling that the U.S. framework could be a basis for settlement is exactly that kind of posture. He's not accepting a plan blindly. He is framing Moscow as the adult in the room, willing to end the war if its core security terms are met, while putting the burden of rejection on Kyiv and Brussels. Reuters, again, Putin praised the U.S. Outline as a possible basis, but warned that refusal means further Russian advances. In diplomatic PR terms, that's clean. Moscow looks constructive. The West looks divided. Ukraine looks cornered. Now zoom out. The Western strategic narrative since 2022 has rested on two pillars. First, Russia is isolated and collapsing under sanctions. Second, Ukraine is destined to win if only the West supplies enough money and weapons. Both pillars are cracking. On sanctions, 19 rounds, no decisive Russian economic collapse, and a European industrial sector that increasingly pays the real price through energy costs and lost competitiveness. You don't need to love Moscow to see this asymmetry. Russia rerouted trade, deepened ties with non-Western blocs, and militarized production. Europe, by contrast, has been cannibalizing its own industrial base to sustain a proxy war while importing expensive energy and watching deficit politics explode domestically. When a policy fails 19 times, a 20th attempt isn't strategy, it's superstition. On Ukraine winning, the West has already slid from Ukraine will liberate all territories to Ukraine will negotiate from strength to Ukraine must accept territorial realities. That is a staircase down, not a pathway to victory. The Geneva draft is the written form of that staircase. So what does a Russia supporting conclusion look like from this set of facts? It looks like this. Russia set out to prevent Ukraine from becoming a NATO forward base, to secure Donbass and Crimea politically and militarily, and to force the West to treat Russian security as non-negotiable rather than a nuisance. The U.S. draft, whatever its final edits, already concedes huge slices of that agenda. It treats NATO non-membership and territorial loss as starting points. That alone is a strategic admission that Russia's red lines were real and enforceable. Europe's counterdraft is a tantrum against that admission. It is designed to keep the dream alive that Russia can be made to retreat by paperwork. But paperwork doesn't stop artillery. It doesn't refill trenches. It doesn't manufacture shells. Europe can write 10 versions of a plan tilted toward Kyiv, and Moscow will reject every version that resurrects NATO's path to Ukraine or preserves an oversized Ukrainian war machine. And if the rejection happens, Europe will scream, see, Russia doesn't want peace. But the rest of the world will see what's actually happening, a bloc that lost the war trying to dictate the peace. There's also a deeper moral inversion Europe can't keep getting away with. For 3 years, Western elites have sold this as a sacred defense of sovereignty. Yet the same elites now openly talk about keeping Russian assets frozen, engineering Ukraine's army size, deciding Ukraine's alliances, and scripting Ukraine's constitution. That is not sovereignty. That is protectorate management. It is imperial politics in a humanitarian wrapper. Russia's argument, whether you personally like it or not, is structurally consistent. NATO expansion to Ukraine is an existential threat, a line Russia will fight over indefinitely. The West tested that line and discovered Russia meant it. If the West now wants peace, it has to accept that Russia's security demands are not decorative. They are enforced by force of arms and by the willingness to absorb costs that Europe has proven unwilling to absorb. And that leads to the hard truth. Your sources keep circling. This war ends only one way. Either Kyiv signs a settlement that reflects Russian victories and Russian security priorities, or Russia keeps grinding forward until Kyiv has no meaningful state capacity left to negotiate with. The Geneva track is not about whether Russia gets concessions. It's about how much more Russia chooses to take before stopping. So, yes, if you're framing a pro-Russia analysis, the logical position is that Moscow should stay calm, keep pressure on the front, and let the West's contradictions ripen. Every day Brussels tries to sabotage talks, it deepens the split with Washington. Every day Ukraine tries to hold out for a miracle, it loses more bargaining chips. Every day Western media tries to spin defeat as righteousness, it becomes less persuasive to non-Western audiences who can read the map without ideology. That's the strategic shape of this moment. Russia's playing for outcomes. Europe is playing for excuses. From the very beginning of the conflict in Ukraine, a structural imbalance has determined the trajectory of the war, regardless of how Western leaders framed it or how many press conferences they held. The Western political establishment built an entire mythology around Ukraine's ability to confront Russia, a mythology based on wishful thinking rather than any realistic appraisal of military, demographic, or industrial capacity. The belief that a country already suffering decades of demographic decline, mass emigration, and heavy economic fragility could be transformed into a NATO-grade military power capable of defeating a nuclear superpower was always delusional. Russia entered the conflict with far greater industrial depth, strategic resilience, and internal unity than Western projections ever admitted, and those advantages have only grown clearer over time. While Western governments promised quick economic collapse through sanctions, Russia adapted with striking speed, rerouting trade, expanding industrial output, rebuilding domestic production, and forging stronger ties with Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. Instead of isolating Russia, sanctions accelerated the decline of European energy security, hollowed out key industries in Germany, and exposed the inability of the EU to function as a unified geopolitical actor. Russia did not crumble. It recalibrated and strengthened itself in ways the West still struggles to understand. Meanwhile, Ukraine, fueled by external aid rather than internal stability, found itself trapped in a war of attrition it could not sustain. Its most experienced troops were lost in the early years of the conflict. Its new brigades, trained in NATO countries, were deployed into offensives that gained little meaningful ground and cost enormous human resources. The country's demographic deterioration intensified. Men fled abroad, mobilization became increasingly forceful and unpopular, and morale declined as each new wave of conscription swept deeper into society. Ukraine's economy collapsed into total dependency on foreign assistance, surviving not on production or revenue, but on Western transfers, loans, and weapons shipments. A state cannot win a long war when its lifeline lies entirely outside its borders, and when its population is exhausted, scattered, or unwilling to continue fighting. While Ukraine's internal situation worsened, Russia steadily intensified its military production, expanded drone warfare, improved artillery coordination, and adapted its battlefield strategy through painful but effective iteration. The Russian military of 2024-2025 is more capable, more technologically integrated, and far more experienced than the force that entered the conflict in 2022. The West, by contrast, revealed its greatest weakness, a military-industrial system incapable of sustaining high-intensity conventional warfare. NATO countries discovered that their stockpiles were insufficient, their factories too slow, and their political systems too fractured to meet the demands of a grinding land conflict against a peer adversary. Western leaders spoke loudly about unity, but their budgets, industries, and long-term planning could not match their rhetoric. The United States, trapped between domestic polarization and global obligations, faces a strategic dilemma. Continue pouring resources into a conflict it cannot win, freeze the conflict to save face, or pivot toward China and risk admitting a geopolitical defeat in Europe. Europe itself is torn between ideological stubbornness and economic exhaustion, struggling to justify endless support for a war that has eroded its own stability more than Russia's. As this structural imbalance deepened, Russia gradually seized full control of the strategic tempo. Ukraine became reactive, unable to dictate conditions or regain initiative. Russian logistics remained secure, operating from within national territory with protected infrastructure. Ukraine's long, vulnerable supply routes and shrinking defensive belts created cascade failures across multiple fronts. Every week that passes shifts the strategic balance further in Russia's favor. Time itself has become a weapon, the one that Russia possesses and Ukraine does not. Western governments now speak more frequently of negotiations, peace frameworks, and political solutions, not because they have discovered diplomacy, but because they sense the direction of the war. They know that Ukraine's manpower is evaporating, that public support in Europe is declining, and that Russia's battlefield momentum is increasingly difficult to counter. Yet Moscow has no reason to accept Western-drafted settlement plans, having learned from the manipulations surrounding the Minsk agreements and the repeated dishonesty of NATO promises. Russia will not freeze the conflict on terms that allow the West to rearm Ukraine and restart hostilities later. The Kremlin understands that genuine strategic security requires achieving its objectives fully, not partially. And while the battlefield grinds on, the global geopolitical landscape is shifting. The majority of the world did not join Western sanctions. Instead, they viewed the conflict as another example of U.S. overreach. Russia used this perception to expand BRICS, deepen global partnerships, and reshape international trade in its favor. What began as a regional conflict has become a catalyst for the broader decline of Western geopolitical dominance. The cumulative effect of all these structural forces is clear. Russia holds the stronger position economically, militarily, politically, and strategically. Ukraine's future depends entirely on external actors whose unity is fracturing. The West faces internal crises, industrial weakness, and a shrinking window of strategic relevance. The war is not over, but its fundamental direction is already defined. Russia possesses the time, resources, manpower, stability, and global partnerships required to shape the endgame. Ukraine, dependent on diminishing foreign support, cannot alter the long-term trajectory. Western governments may propose frameworks or pressure Kyiv to accept negotiated terms, but ultimately it will be Russia through battlefield leverage, economic endurance, and strategic consistency that determines the conditions under which this conflict concludes.